I decided when I got up this morning, it was a wee bit chilly, and I decided to pull out one of my pullovers. I may live to repent of it later. We have just started the book of Exodus. We started the introduction last Sunday, and this is sort of like the continuation of the introduction and adding some more things, information about the man called Moses. And Moses is the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. Became known as the Torah, or the word I love to say, the Pentateuch. I think it's a Scottish word. I really do. So, Moses before the call. And so what we'll do today is I want to present some outlines that you could follow. We will actually go to the chosen outline that we'll be using for this particular quarter. But I want to present some other outlines that are more simplified and not as complicated, plus an expanded outline, and then we'll look at some of the passages of Scripture that introduce us to what Exodus is all about. There is a golden thread that runs through the entire Bible. It starts at Genesis and ends at the book of Revelation. It takes us on a journey to God bringing us salvation. It's the story of a people called the Hebrews who became the Israelites, who we also call the Jews. We are introduced to the prophets of the time, the patriarchs, and all the other biblical characters. You know what I like about the Bible is it doesn't necessarily gloss over anyone. We get the full story. I like that, don't you? And so God chooses sometimes men and women who have flaws. Ditto. So, Genesis and Exodus. Genesis being the book of beginnings, and Exodus being the book of departure. It's about God and the patriarchs, about God talking to the heads of families, about God talking to people like Noah, and Adam, then Abraham and others. And then we move into a phase in the book of Exodus where God is talking to the people, but through Moses. Moses wants more out of God than anyone I know. He's not happy with just knowing his, his voice. He wants to meet God. He wants to see God. He wants to get close to God. He wants more than just a name or names. Moses becomes the conduit to the people, as Jesus is our conduit to God through Jesus Christ. In the book of Exodus, it is about God bringing the law to the people. So, Genesis is a book of origins or a book of beginnings. In the Hebrew, it is Bereshit. 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 Beginnings. What I like about how the latter part of Genesis ends and how the start of the first few verses of the book of Exodus is a link. Beautifully linked. It's about Abraham and the promises that he received from God. It's about ending with the story of Jacob, about Israel, and how in all 70 persons came to Egypt during a famine, during a time of drought. Exodus about names, about a departure. You know, we look up there, there's the word exit. We could have put up the word Exodus. This way out. So, in the Greek, in the Septuagint, the word is exodos. You can read that in Greek. You can figure out the letters for yourself. It is the way out. You know what's interesting about Moses is he was given a name by whom? We think, even though in Hebrew the name of Moses is Moshe, I wonder in modern society would he have been known by the name of Mo? But Moshe, it would seem that perhaps because of the actions at the direction of one of Pharaoh's daughters, he was pulled out after his mother made a little ark of bulrushes covered in pitch and nicely floated towards the princess, taking her dip with her handmaidens. Moses was pulled out to take Israel out. By the way, the word ekklesia is we are the called out. Pulled out, led out, called out. I love that theme, don't you? In the Hebrew, it reads this, Shemo, meaning just names. If Genesis has the singular name of beginnings or origins, the book of Exodus is singularly known as, in the Hebrew Bible, by the Hebrews, book of names. Two-part outline, very simple. Chapters 1 through 18 would be the deliverance. Chapters 19 to 40, the giving of the covenant. The covenant and the commandments would be 19 to 24 of the book of Exodus chapters. Chapters 25 to 40 would be the instructions of putting together the tabernacle. The tabernacle being sort of a movable place for God. And God would come down and he would make his presence known. And people at times got a wee bit terrified. God was kind of scary to them. Here's a three-part outline based on relationships. One of redemption as the Lord delivers his people, chapters 1 through 18. So that's a different way of looking at the book of Exodus. Number 2 is the covenant, is where the Lord This is chapters 19 through 24. Here is the Lord not only delivering his people, this is the Lord claiming his people. And then chapters 25 to 40, it is the relationship based on worship, the Lord dwelling with his people. I like that one. Redemption, covenant, and worship. Then we have an outline based on experience, their experiences with God. Moses' experiences with God. Chapter 1 through, verse 1 through chapter 13, verse 16 is God's people are delivered. Getting out of Egypt. And you know, the people were so glad to see them go that they took off everything that they were wearing. Their amulets, their rings, their jewelry, you know, it was go, 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 you know. But, you know, that gold became an anchor around their neck, actually not an anchor, but a millstone around their neck that they were, later on they were tempted to create and asked for Aaron to build something, a bull, a calf. This is the God who delivered us. How in the world could they ever do that? And then 3, God's people made into a covenant nation. Chapters 19 to 24. 4, God's people given the instructions for the tabernacle. Chapters 25 to 31. It all had to be built and put together in a certain way. And God manifested his presence with a cloud during the daytime, this big cloud. And they saw the cloud and they say, God's here. And then there was this pillar of fire by night. It literally was the biggest night light ever. So the people felt safe. That would be chapters 25 to 31. Next is God's people in sin. This was where they got a wee bit impatient because Moses hadn't come back. Was he ever going to come back? Did God take his life? Did God keep him up there? Aaron's down at the bottom trying to calm everybody down, but you know, he goes with the flow. He gives what the people want. In Story of the Golden Calf, chapters 32 to 34. And then there is the construction period. We had the instructional period of how to build a tabernacle. Then they actually go to work in building the tabernacle. Chapters 35 to 40. Now here's the expanded outline, just very quickly. A summary of Genesis, Bereshit, means beginnings or origins. You know, have you ever wondered, was the hand of Moses tired from writing all this down? Well, we do know that God's hand was involved in the writing of the 10 Commandments, or the 10 words. I'm sure God was really miffed on the people. And miffed about Moses because Moses just broke that original copy, 2 of them. One kept in remembrance and one that was read out to the people time and time again. The author and date of the book of Moses was somewhere between 1447 and 1400 BC. When did Jacob and his 70 arrive in Egypt? This is a guesstimate, around 1600 BC. Have you ever wondered how long did the people of God stay in slavery? 400 and some 30 years. You can check Acts chapter 7, verse 16, I think, or Galatians chapter 3, that mentions about 430 years. But this is what I'm interested in. They weren't always slaves. So how long were they not slaves before they became slaves? Well, we have to look at that date of 1600 BC. Here's what the history books have said. When they arrived in Egypt, because of the drought, because of the famine, Joseph's family are totally unaware that Joseph was now prime minister. He is like a grand vizier. He is second only to Pharaoh. He is the one who has launched a plan to save the nation of Egypt. But what we read about at the end, round about chapter 49 and chapter 50 of the book of Genesis, is Joseph comes to the conclusion, you thought you were doing me harm, but now I understand what God was up to. It was to save you and to save the people, to save the Hebrew people. God, he says, God sent me ahead. And what a journey that was. So, if we think that when Moses is born, he is born into slavery. The Hebrews are already, they know a change of time. We think that the first people of Egypt that they met were more inclined to welcome the Hebrews. They were given the land of Goshen to put their herds and to raise their families. It was in the fertile delta of the Nile. Well, there was a change of administration. We think that another group who didn't see it the way the Hyksos might have seen it, that these were people who should be welcomed. They had maybe 100 or maybe a little bit more to grow up and sort of flourish. And then the new Pharaoh checks in. He's not a Hyksos. He's something else. He's the man who's going to try and destroy the people. So, that would have been 1447 or so. The geography and the history of Egypt. Egypt lived because of the Nile, because of the fertility of the place. The purpose of Exodus is God giving birth to a people called Israel. We have deliverance as a stage 1, chapter 1, verse 1, through chapter 6, verse 27. We will concentrate on that this morning. Under that, we have Israel getting enslaved, chapter 1, verse 1. One day they go to bed, and it's the Hyksos. Then there's a war. There is a power struggle. The Hyksos are gone. Now there's a new Pharaoh in town, and things are going to be different. And there is growing animosity from the Egyptians towards the Hebrew people. Moses becomes the deliverer. He grows up, he is rescued, he is fostered in the palace of a princess. He learns how to walk and talk like an Egyptian. He dresses like an Egyptian. Yeah, you like my wee joke, right? Well, you know, when Moses flees to Midian, one of the things that the girls said, an Egyptian rescued us today. He didn't come kitted out in Hebrew clothing. He just arrived. 40 years in Egypt, 40 years in Midian, and 40 years leading the people through the desert. 40, 40, 40. We talk about initial failures. After God convinces Moses, I want you to go back and talk to Pharaoh. But it's not the same Pharaoh that was there when the administration changed. There was a change. If it were the same Pharaoh, don't you think he might have remembered? We don't know. But what's interesting is Moses says, I don't think the Hebrew people are going to take to this. I don't think they want to know. I don't think they will listen. Nor will Pharaoh listen. And the reason I've got Exodus 4 verse 2 there, if you look at it in your Bible, is God gives Moses an important part of his kit, a staff. God says to Moses, what is that in your hand? And sometimes we underestimate, we don't realize what God has already given us to do his bidding, to do his work. So, that is chapter 4, verse 27 to chapter 6, verse 13. And then verse 14 of chapter 6 through to verse 27 is a genealogy of Moses and Aaron. So, deliverance stage 2, I'm just going to go through that quickly because next week John Hamilton will be presenting the next 6 lessons. Chapter 6, verse 28 to 12, chapter 12, verse 36 is the deliverance continues. God promises them success, verse 28 through chapter 7, verse 7. The miracle of the staff. So, when Moses reaches the palace and knocks on the palace door, I am sent me. Who? In Egypt, every god had a name. A fly was the name of a god. The Nile was the name of a god. A crocodile was the name of a god. Everything had a name. That was why Moses says, well, if you want me to go, what's your name? And God says, tell them the big I am sent you. I am. That's all you need to know. I'm with you. I'm here. He learned that facing God at the burning bush. Then deliverance via the 10 plagues. Chapter 7, 14 to chapter 12, verse 36. Then we have the big Exodus, leaving Egypt, getting out of Egypt. Chapter 12, 37 to chapter 18, 27. And going out of Egypt, it begins at verse 37 through chapter 15, verse 21. Their journey to Sinai. You know, they could have been there a whole lot sooner had they not complained and doubted. Chapter 15 through 18:27, 15:22 to 18:27. God makes a covenant between himself and Israel. Chapter 19 through chapter 40, verse 38. An agreement, a treaty. Covenant is made, verse 1 of chapter 19 to 25. The people do these things. They react, they ratify, they receive the law and the covenant. Chapter 20, verse 1 through chapter 24, verse 18. Then plans are drawn up for the creation of a tabernacle. If they spent 430 years as slaves, immersed, and any time prior to those 430, they were spending as guests before they became slaves, they became accustomed to the culture of Egypt, the worship, the gods of Egypt. Hence, why did they ask, create us a golden bull, a golden calf, that we can bow down and say, this is the God who delivered us? What were they thinking? And you know, don't we do sometimes the same stupid stuff? And God says, what were you thinking? Then there is the period of apostasy. That time where they doubted, that time where they worshiped the golden calf. And, you know, talk about eating your words. God made them to eat that stuff after they burned down and melted and turned it into ash, stirred it around, and they all were told to drink it. Isn't it interesting that, remember the fiery serpents that came along? And if you didn't look to the bronze snake on a stick, they died. Have you ever wondered what happened to that snake on a stick? Well, they carried it around them. They brought it with them. And instead of worshiping a golden calf, they called that Nehushtan, that detestable thing, but somehow it was still in their luggage. Instead of looking to God as their deliverer. So, the building of the tabernacle, chapter 35 to 39, chapter 39 and verse 43, the consecration of the temple of the tabernacle, chapter 40 through verse 38. So, Joseph's family in Egypt, Moses' birth, the date of the entire Pentateuch, because it was during his lifetime that he writes down the first 5 books of the Bible. The history of and geography of Egypt, 3,000 years plus. That's how long Egypt lasted as a superpower until God brought the 10 plagues. Oh, by the way, one of the things that the Egyptians didn't like to do is they didn't like to carve on stone their defeats. They only like to highlight their victories. If they didn't like a pharaoh, from one administration to the next, what did they do? They chiseled his name out of all government monuments, defaced him so that his name would be lost to history. So, Israel's enslaved, chapter 1, verses 1 to 22. Now, these are the names. These are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, Benjamin, Dan, and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. All the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number. But Joseph was already in Egypt, making preparations. Verses 6 to 7, and Joseph died and all his brothers and all that generation, but the sons of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly and multiplied and became exceedingly mighty, that it became a threat to Pharaoh down there in Thebes, so that the land was filled with them. Verses 8 through 10, now a new king arose, a new Pharaoh arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Those generations mean nothing to him because he's from a different group. He said to his people, behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Oh! Come, let us deal wisely with them, or else they will multiply, and in the event of war, they will also join themselves to those who hate us. The people round about who hated the Egyptians. And they will fight against us and depart from the land. That's an interesting statement. We want to control them, but how are they going to control them? How are they going to keep them as a workforce, a slave workforce? He comes up with a plan. So we have three things to note. Oppression by forced labor. That's the day they wake up. They went to bed as guests. They wake up as slaves. Then there is the Egyptian style of birth control. Genocide at birth to all male children. There was a pogrom. A pogrom is a program against all the male children who are being born at that time. And the fact is, no sooner had they thought the population control was going down, it started to rise again. Verses 11 to 12 tells, so the Egyptians made the Israelites their slaves. They appointed brutal slave drivers over them, hoping to wear them down with crushing labor. They'd be too tired to have any more children. They forced them to build the cities of Pithom and Ramesses as supply centers for the king. But the more the Egyptians oppressed them, the opposite was the effect. The more the Israelites multiplied and spread, and the more alarmed the Egyptians became. So the Egyptians worked the people of Israel without mercy. They made their lives so bitter, forcing them to mix mortar and make bricks and do all the work in the fields. They were ruthless in all their demands. And then Pharaoh, king of Egypt, gave this order. Gave this order to Hebrew midwives Shiphrah and Puah. Surely, just 2 midwives could handle all the births, or at least these are the 2 names that stand out. When you help the Hebrew women as they give birth, watch as they deliver. If the baby is a boy, kill it. If it is a girl, let her live. Instead of abortion in the womb, it is the life of the child is ended at the point of birth as it came forth from the womb. Verses 13 to 16. But because the midwives feared God more than they feared Pharaoh, they refused to obey the king's orders. They allowed the boys to live. So the king of Egypt called for the midwives. Why have you done this? He demanded, why have you allowed the boys to live? The Hebrew women told the truth, they said. Well, they added a wee bit. They said, the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women, you know. They are more vigorous and have their babies so quickly that we cannot get to them in time. So God was good to those midwives. And the Israelites continued to multiply, growing more and more powerful. And because the midwives feared God, he gave them families of their own. Then Pharaoh gave this order. Here's the big change. If we can't catch them at birth, this is what we'll do. To all his people, to all Egyptian people, throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile. What's in the Nile besides water? Meat eaters, crocs. Throw every newborn Hebrew boy into the Nile, but you may let the girls live. How magnanimous is that? That's just a map to indicate what Egypt looked like. In the little box down below there is what we believe is the place where they crossed the Red Sea. Five circles, one to represent Memphis, the old capital, Thebes, the new capital, the land of Goshen, the fertile valley that they had lived in for quite a few generations until a new Pharaoh rose. Down below there is Sinai, and up above is the promised land, Canaan. By the way, on the Hyksos, we believe they were of Canaanite origin. The deliverer, Moses, his early life. Now, a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and she bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. That's Exodus 2, 1 through 2. If you were to go to Exodus 6, verses 18 to 20, you actually discover who his parents are. Amram and Jochebed. And when you read Hebrews 11 and 23, it says, the parents of Moses hid him. Verse 3 and 4, but when she could hide him no longer, well, the baby's growing, the baby's crying more, and so on and so forth. She got him a wicker basket, covered it over with tar and pitch, and then she put the child into it, set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance, Miriam, the older, to find out what would happen to him. And Aaron is also his brother. Verses 5 through 6, the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the Nile. I believe it was a crocodile-free area. When I say the daughter of Pharaoh, he had more than one daughter, and he had probably more than one wife. The daughter of Pharaoh came to bathe at the Nile with her maidens, walking alongside the Nile, and when she saw the basket among the reeds, she sent her maid, and she brought it to her, and when she opened it, she saw the child. Behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrew children." Ooh. First bell. Verses 7 through 8, his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, who just happened to be there. No, she was watching all along. "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. And don't you think that during that period of time where she was nursing and caring for Moses, who is barely one yet, she told him about his real people? I wonder if she thought that this was always by the hand of God. One would have to believe that. Yes, I do. So, Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son by adoption. She named him Moses. There must have been another longer part of his name, but we get Moses because he was pulled out. He was rescued to become a rescuer. Because I drew him out of the water, I pulled him out of the water. Names are not by accident when we read God's purpose and plans. So, we're almost ready for the second bell. We have oppression, Israel's growth and prosperity. We have violence, Israel's multiplication, and the violence increases. Then we have the proposed genocide about children being thrown into the Nile. How many male children were fed to the crocs or who drowned in the river Nile? And that's the period where Moses enters the royal court. He has title of Prince of Egypt, or Prince of the Princess of Egypt. One of his ancestors, Joseph, was at one time Grand Vizier of Egypt. He saved Egypt. Moses isn't going to save Egypt. He is going to save his people by leading them out. Moses lived 120 years, a life in 3 phases. As a royal prince, adopted, son of a princess. He was educated in the ways of Egypt. He knew all about their gods. He knew about hieroglyphics. You know? He knew sciences. He knew the art of war. What was God doing with Moses for 40 years ensconced in the palace of Egypt? He was preparing Moses to be a great leader of his people who would also know tactics. The first was a 40-year slice of his life. The second is another 40-year slice of his life. He goes from prince to shepherd in the wilderness of Midian. And that was quite a journey. And he works for his father-in-law to be called Jethro. Number 3, the final slice of 40 years of his life as a Hebrew leader, leading the Israelites out of their bondage as oppressed slaves. They could have been in Canaan well before, but they had to do, as I have said, Mike, on so many occasions, remedial journeying in the wilderness. Now it came about in those days when Moses had grown up, he went out to his brethren and he looked on their hard labors, and he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And one of his brethren, so he looked this way and that way. You know, I remember one time getting rid of a TV I was given that I didn't want. And so I went to a 7-Eleven store, and the big doors were open, and it was late at night. But unbeknownst to me, my in-laws were in a car getting gas. And what does Gordon do with this TV he doesn't want? He looks, and later on in the conversation they asked, what was that I was depositing in the trash bin at the 7-Eleven in Kimberling City? So Moses looks to the left and to the right and maybe again, and he strikes down the Egyptian, buries him in the sand. And it didn't go down too well, because why? They don't recognize him as a Hebrew. He still looks and walks and talks like an Egyptian, and he has killed an Egyptian. And so word gets around, and he has to flee. And you know, sometimes God allows things to take place in order to move things along. We'll stop there. Thank you.